So I have a materials background. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I think this talk will be a little bit different from all the other talks that I have heard, which are wonderful, because here we're mainly taking a what I call engineer's approach. So so this means that we're going to focus more on the application of the method instead of going after the rigorous proofs, and we will see a lot of examples. So with that, and also I think in this talk we'll mainly include two parts. The first one is on microstructure modeling, and the second part will be on mechanical analysis using lattice models. And this most of the mechanical analysis was actually done in collaboration with Dr. Hailong Chen, who will present probably a much in-depth talk I think on Friday. Okay, so okay, is my slide showing okay here? Good. So yes, so as I said, you know, I think it's fair to say that the holy grail of material science engineering is the so-called structure property relations, which basically imply that, you know, the macroscopic and overall performance and behavior of material is determined by its hierarchical microstructures that are spanned over a wide range of length scales, all the way from atomic level into the macro scale. Okay, so in principle, that any material performance, any behavior you see of the material will couple all these lengths together. But the lucky thing is that for most useful engineering properties of interest, like, you know, most of the mechanical properties like elastic moduli, you know, the tensile strengths and things like that, there's a kind of a single length scale that plays the most important role, and we'll call this length scale the mesoscale, where you can see that, you know, the grain structures of the material. So what I show here is a simulated a small trunk of titanium alloy. So the size of this is probably several hundred microns on each direction. And what you can see here is the complex grain microstructure. So these polyhedral-like tessellations are the primary alpha grains, and then these very finer, you know, directional lines are the beta grains, and these are formed during the particular solidification processes related to how the material is manufactured. Okay, so and it has been established that the mechanical properties of, you know, this alloy is very sensitive and mainly determined by these grain microstructures. So if you want to make a very good prediction, reliable prediction of the mechanical properties, I think the most important thing is that you need to understand this microstructure. Okay. So actually, there are two directions that you can go in the structural property mapping. The first one is the forward direction, which means that, you know, if you know the microstructure, which we do, you know, thanks to the you know, the recent progress in advanced imaging techniques like tomography, and also you can do zero sectioning by imaging this material layer by layer and reconstruct a three-dimensional structure. But there are ways that people can actually obtain the microstructure of the system, right? Once you know the microstructure, you can apply analytical tools or computational tools to, you know, simulate the overall mechanical behavior of the system. This is what I call the forward direction. And more recently, the community has been getting extremely interested in going to the other direction, the invert direction, what we typically call material design, right? This means that, you know, you want to achieve a particular set of properties of the material. So I want this material to have this Young's modulus and this yield strength and this tensile strength, right? And what microstructure should look like. You know, how should I design the microstructure material so that I can achieve these specific values of the properties? This is a design problem. And from engineering point of view, right? So the design problem is basically a search of the microstructure space, right? Because we want to find a microstructure that give you these properties. Now, if you have a mapping that enables to connect the microstructure to the properties, like this, what we call the response surface, and we can, you know, there are different methods available to search this response surface, to search the microstructure space to find some extremal points. For example, in this one, it's probably the best Young's modulus, for example, for the material, and then you can find a way to try to manufacture the material to realize this microstructure. But this approach seems very straightforward, but there's some important challenges in here. The first one is that the microstructure space is a very high dimensional object, right? So if you think about what is a microstructure, okay, typically this is a very huge digital volume, you know, composed of voxels. I think the size for this system probably contains billions of voxels. So it has roughly speaking, 1,000 voxels along each direction. So you have a three-dimensional volume, so there's billions of voxels. It's a very large data set. And each voxel can have different values, right? So this is a simple case that you just have black and white. You can have the binary system where the values can take only two values, but there are other systems, as we'll show later, there are multiple phases in the system. There are multiple, materials in the system, so they can take multiple values, and this can give you a very high dimensional space to search. So to make this to be a mathematical or computational feasible, I think the first thing we have to, or the challenge we have to address, is that we need to find a reduced dimension representation to quantify the microstructure, so we can actually, perform a search, right? And this will be, at least in this talk, we will propose a method called correlation function-based microstructure modeling, and this will allow us to reduce this high-dimensional microstructure space to hierarchical sets of correlation functions, mathematical well-defined functions that possibly enable us to search the space. And one key requirement for this reduction is that this also needs to be in two directions, right? We need to map the microstructure to these functions, which enable us to do manipulations and search and design. But also we need to go back from these reduced dimension representations, go back from these functions to an actual microstructure. This is what we call the reconstruction, right? And only have this real microstructure, and you can actually perform the computations to get the properties. So this is the first challenge that we need to address. And the second one is that, now suppose we have this very nice way of searching the microstructure space, of representing the microstructure space. Another key requirement for the design is that you have to find a tool that can very quickly and efficiently and robustly evaluate the mechanical performance of this, for a given microstructure, for a given material, right? So this is where the lattice model for mechanical analysis come into the picture. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, we'll quickly mention both of these tools that enable, hopefully, that make this material design feasible. So we'll first talk about the correlation function-based microstructure modeling. And the idea is very straightforward. So let's first focus on the binary system. Okay, so just to have a random microstructure, and we can say the material have two different phases, okay, denoted by different colors. And here we define the so-called phase indicator function. Okay, this is a very simple step function. So it's a function of the position in a system. And if you're interested in a particular phase, for the red phase, for example, and you can consider this position in a scan over the entire system. And if this X fall into the phase of interest, for example, this red region, and this function, indicator function for the red phase has a value of 1. Okay, now if it falls into the white phase, it has 0. So basically, this is a step function which you can imagine is stand out, on top of the phase of interest. Okay, if you have the indicator function for all of the phases in the system, in this case, you only have two phases. So if you know the indicator function for one, the other also is known, because altogether they add to be unity. But if you know all the indicator function for all the phases, you know the microstructure. So now in this work, we not focus on the indicator function themselves, but rather focus on the moments of the indicator function. And we call these the so-called endpoint correlation function. So basically, what you do here is that you take the product of the indicator functions evaluated at different points in the system, and these points can be randomly selected. And then you take the ensemble average over all realizations of the microstructure. Okay, so this basically give you a kind of ensemble average moments of the correlation function. We call this the endpoint correlation function. So, and if you look at this product, actually it gives you a very nice probability interpretation. So we'll illustrate this using the most simple correlation functions, the 1 point and 2 point, right? So now based on the definition, the 1 point correlation function is simply the ensemble average of the indicator function itself. So this means that, we'll evaluate this ensemble average or this volume average if the system is ergodic. You can randomly throwing down points in the system, right? And sometimes you get 0 and sometimes you get 1, right? And you add all of these zeros and ones together and divide this number by the total number of points you throw in the system, okay? But if you add all these numbers together, you're only gonna count basically the points that give you 1, right? So the denominator is gonna be the total number of points, but the numerator will only be the points that fall into the phase of interest. So if you look at this very simple calculation, the 1 point correlation function is simply the fraction of a large number, a randomly selected large number of points, okay, a fraction of that point that fall into the phase of interest. So this gives you the volume fraction of the phase of interest. Okay, so this is the interpretation of the one-point correlation function. And the two-point correlation function have a very similar interpretation. But in this case, instead of throwing down 1 point, you're throwing down 2 points together. And these 2 points can be quantified by their separation distances if the microstructure is very nice and isotropic. Okay, so basically the probability interpretation for the two-point correlation function is that you're randomly throwing down a line segment of length r in the system, and what is the probability that both ends of this line segment fall into the phase of interest. Okay, so there are a number of scenarios that you can achieve this. For example, if the line is very short, you can have the whole both endpoints fall into the same cluster of the phase of interest. But if your the length of the line is very long, these 2 points may fall into different clusters, but still have the same phase. But they're all going to contribute to the two-point correlation function. Okay, so now you can basically this logic continues for higher order correlation functions. But for those higher order correlation functions, you have a particular endpoint configuration, and you randomly throwing down this endpoint configuration in the system, and you require that all the endpoints fall into the phase of interest, and that's going to give you account for the corresponding endpoint correlation function. Okay, so this is the definition of the correlation functions. And based on this definition, you can clearly see that we can reduce the microstructure. We can actually convert this digital volume to a set of functions, right? You can compute 1 point, 2 points, 3 point. In principle, you can continue this series to whatever you think is sufficient to quantify the microstructure. But this provides a hierarchical way of reducing the dimensionality of that whole microstructure space to a set of well-defined mathematical functions, right? And based on the statistical or probability interpretation, it's very straightforward to compute these functions from that digital volume. So basically, you just need to count the number of pixels at different separation distances, and then you normalize this number of pair. This is for two-point correlation functions, right? So you normalize this separation pairs by the total available separation pairs, and that's going to give you the corresponding correlation function. Now, for the one-point correlation function, it's very straightforward. You just count the total number of black pixels divided by the number of available pixels. You get the volume fraction. So you can do similar things for higher order correlation functions. And this allows you to basically convert a digital volume of microstructure into the correlation function. So this is the first direction, right? We can reduce dimensionality. But as I mentioned before, the most important thing is you can go in this direction by computing a correlation function from the microstructure, but also you need to go from the correlation function to a microstructure, right? Suppose that you find a design in terms of the correlation function, how can you go back to the microstructure? This is what we call the reconstruction. And just to quickly go through these, and the ideas are very straightforward. We use stochastic optimization to achieve this goal. So the constraint is that we know the correlation function, but we don't know the microstructure. But we can always make initial guess, right? And we use the example of the binary structure. So this means that you can just start with a random distribution of black and white pixels, or in this case, red and blue pixels. And once you have a realization, which is completely different from the actual microstructure you're looking for, and you can compute the same correlation function that is used as constraint. For example, in this case, the two-point correlation function, right? So now you know a target function like this, and you have this correlation function for your random microstructure. So we can define energy, which basically the difference between these two functions and here. And because the correlation function is discrete, so we can basically define in a very convenient way that the energy as the square difference, sum of the square difference between two correlation functions. So this basically, so you have two quantities here. So this hat S2 our hat is the reference state. This is a black curve, right? And for each trial microstructure, for each random microstructure you generate, you will have a different S2. So basically, this means that for each microstructure, you can, define an energy associated with this microstructure, right? So here, okay, we have a random microstructure. We call it old microstructure, but you can, do some perturbation of this random microstructure. In this case, we randomly select a set of blue pixels and red pixels, and we switch their position. So we generate a new microstructure. Okay, each microstructure generated gonna be associated with an energy, right? But if you think about this process, if you think about this problem, if we can find a microstructure that have a minimal energy, which means E goes to 0, This means that whatever this microstructure looks like, but this microstructure will have identical 2-point correlation function as my target, okay? So we call this a successful reconstruction. Now, whether the microstructure you find have identical correlation function will look the same as the target is not guaranteed, because it's not quite clear whether the 2-point correlation function will be sufficient to quantify all of the microstructure information for a certain system. But at least this will define an optimization problem that allow us to find a microstructure that can match all of the statistics or match all of the representations that we define. Okay, so that's basically the reconstruction processes. And the way we do that is through stochastic optimization. So we continue these processes. We start with a random microstructure or given microstructure. We randomly select a pair of different pixels. We switch the pixels to generate a new microstructure. And then what we do is we compare the energy of the new and old microstructure, and we use simulate annealing to reduce its energy, but in a mild way. So we do not directly jump to the lowest, the nearest local minimum. We first allow energy uphill moves to try our best to get out of the possible local maximum, and then during the later stage we only accept the energy decrease moves. So hopefully this will allow us to achieve a global minimum. But again, if the system is very large, in most cases we're going to get stuck in local minimum.
Sorry, Yang.
Yes.
But if you get so you minimize this energy functional with which is the difference of the energies of some of corresponding regions of these two structures.
Yes, this is energy defined by statistics of the microstructure. So it's not the corresponding. So basically, you compute the correlation function from both images or both microstructures, but this correlation function is not local. So it is actually include all pair separation. So for example, if I'm looking, what I'm showing here is just I illustrate, for example, this is a pixel in the center, and we consider all these pixels within the same length compatible with the lattice, right? But you can choose a different center and do the same thing. So the correlation function is the statistics of the entire microstructure over the whole volume. It's not just a single region. Okay. And we want to, yeah.
Okay, so can you return to the next slide?
Yeah.
With that, so yeah, this one. So each R, and you have how many R's? R is countable or a continuum? What is this?
In this case, it's discretized because R is the distance between the 2 points, right? If you're a single point, there's no R because you just get one fraction. Okay. But here, we're throwing down 2 points here, right? So the separation distance of these 2 points can be a variable. So this is going to give you a function because for each separation distance, you're going to get a different probability, right? And when this distance goes to 0, you just get the one fraction, which is the 1 point. And if the distance is very far, which means in a random system, and this 2 point are going to be decorrelated, so you just get the square of the volume.
So you fix this R, and then you have a circle centered at R, and that circle may cover several pixels.
Yes, essentially that. Yeah, that's the idea. When we actually do the calculation, we simply directly, compute the distance between the pixels. We do not really use the circle template, but we just compute it with the distance, and we bin the distance matrix. So that's okay. Because in a digital material, we only work with integer distances, which are measured with respect to the unit length of a voxel or a pixel.
Yes, and then my question is, so by minimizing, assume that you minimized this capital E.
Yes.
Does it tell you anything about how close the topology of one system, or the topology of the material, maybe, I don't know, to the topology of another material? Because you just get equal energies in certain regions, in certain groups of pixels, but how it reflects similarity between the materials?
Yes, so this is a very good question. So it went reflect the similarity, because this is what we call a uniqueness issue. It means that basically the question is that whether the statistics you impose or you use to construct the energy functional is sufficient to uniquely define a microstructure. Right, that's the question. If it's unique,
yeah,
so
maybe yes,
yeah,
kind of that, yes.
yeah. So that's a good question. We don't have a definitive answer to that one, but the basic idea is that in most of the cases, these correlation functions are not unique to determine a single microstructure, but in certain cases will, as we'll show later. But nonetheless, it's going to give you, or it encodes what we consider to be a most crucial microstructure information in a statistical sense that are that play a most important role in determining the properties of the system. Okay, so for example, if I'll show later. I'll show later that you have two systems generated using this method. They're not exactly the same if you compare a pixel by another pixel, right? But if you look at overall microstructure, for example, if one system includes some clusters or inclusions of some weird shape or things like that, the reconstructed system will not look exactly the same as the target, but it will actually have statistical similarity with the target, and we can quantify the statistical similarity using other correlation functions. So does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't give you a unique system, but it give you basically this is gonna randomly draw realizations from a sample that share the same statistics. That's what it's doing. We're not trying to uniquely recover whatever that you compute the correlation function from. I should probably emphasize this later. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So yes, so that's the basic idea. And here I'll give you an example. So again, this is a very toy problem, but it illustrates, at least on this problem, you see uniqueness. Okay, so on the left, what we show is the target microstructure. It's a very typical eutectic microstructure you get from a solid-to-solid phase transformation in many systems, many binary alloy. And the right one is just we start with a random initial configuration. You can see that the black and white phase are just randomly distributed. Okay, so and now we start to use the simulated annealing to evolve the system. And initially, you didn't see any patterns forming. You see just the black pixels moving around randomly. This is because the fake temperature is high, so we allow a lot of uphill moves so the system can explore the energy landscape. But as we keep on lowering the temperature, you can see that the black pixels begins to converge into some pattern, into the structure. Okay. And towards the very late, stage of the annealing, there are only some individual pixels moving around, and this is, means the system probably stuck into a local energy minimum. But overall, this is okay for us as an engineer because you already see the reconstructed microstructure looks very similar to the original one, right? So now, if you take a closer look at these two structures, that's basically answer, I think, some part of the question. You see that these two are very similar, but they're clearly different. The first one is that the system on the right is kind of rotated by 90 degrees with respect to the system on the left, right? So the direction of these lines are not the same. This is because in the correlation function we put into the reconstruction, we use to construct energy, does not distinguish direction. We use distance. We do not use displacement. So it does not distinguish directions. So that's why you can have this rotational degeneracy. And also you see that it seems like that these lines are broken. Okay, they're not all connected to one another. Okay, but if you think about that, and this is another degeneracy we have, is because when we use reconstruction to make sure that each part of the system is treated equally, we use periodic boundary condition. So although we in the reconstruction we explicitly focus on this small domain, but we're imagining that you have a repeating tessellation of the whole space or whole 2D plane using this pattern. So if you're looking at a corner here, basically, you're actually, the corner going to go back here. So we use a periodic boundary condition. And because we do not impose continuity of these lines across this boundary. So, and if you do a translation, you will see the same continuity here. So that's basically explaining the two degeneracy. We do not constrain these degeneracy using the correlation function. So that's why you see the non-uniqueness. But on the other hand, you do see that statistically, these systems are very similar. If you do a measure of mechanical property of this guy, say you pull the system along this vertical direction, I would imagine that you will get very similar results as if you pull the system along the horizontal direction for the reconstruction. So that is basically what we mean here. So again, the reconstruction allows us to basically get realizations, generate a collection of realizations of these random microstructure associated with some prescribed statistics. Okay, that's basically the first part. And this, you know, we apply this again. We didn't prove anything, but we apply this method to many different heterogeneous systems. Like this is aluminum, iron, and silicon alloy. It contains, you know, these clusters, or we sometimes call these precipitates of different phases. This is from the, you know, we compute the correlation function from probably single, I can't remember, just a handful of two-dimensional slides, and use this statistics to reconstruct three-dimensional microstructure, and we can generate a bunch of those to get ensemble average. And just to show one of them here, and this is from the stochastic reconstruction. And these sets are actually from the real material. So we use tomography to image the shape and size of
Hailong, you hear us? Hailong.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, can you maybe make a phone call to Yang?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yep. I will contact him on that. Sure.
Ask him, yeah, whether he can repair the connection.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I can check with him.
Mm. So let's see. Hopefully we can get him back in a couple of minutes.
Okay, so this is the example, and so we have, you know, this is a very simple example where we have this kind of discretized faces, but this method also applies very well to more complex microstructure. For example, this polycrystalline structure where you have many different grains with different orientations. In here, they're distinguished by colors. Well, the correlation function sets are much larger, but the general principle still works here, and the microstructure we construct is also statistically similar to the actual experimental results. And in here, you can see this is a very heterogeneous structure, but still the method seems to be working. And lastly, I want to show that, you know, the idea using correlation function is that you can use this to probe or search the microstructure space. And we show that this is also feasible because you can parameterize the correlation functions incorporating the actual physics. In here, we use the correlation function to basically search the microstructure or model the microstructure evolution in the binary alloy during the aging processes. So if you have the alloy, if you heat up this alloy below the melting temperature, the phase is going to develop and the black phase will get thicker and thicker. But we show that, you know, you can, and this microstructure is very well approximated by analytical correlation function, and we can parameterize this function to basically generate the whole spectrum of microstructure. So this basically shows its capability of using as a quantific, you know, representation, microstructure representation. Yes.
And why you search, how you use that search for microstructure? So you find a range of possible microstructures, and then you pick some best one from that, from what you found.
Yes, yes, exactly. So the whole idea of using the correlation function is that we can reduce the microstructure to some manageable sets, right? Because eventually we want to design, we want to do some design, we want to find a microstructure.
You can probably do some 3D printing or okay.
Yeah, yes, depending on what system we have, right? If you have, you know, the 3D, I think, is the most straightforward way that you can do for this system. But even you have the additional alloy, for example, in this case, right, this is a Lattice alloy, which we, you know, typically used in all electronic devices as solid material. And the size of this black phase clearly determines the mechanical properties. If you drop your cell phone, you don't want this interconnects to be broken, you want it to be stable, right? So you can still use a cell phone. So the size of this black basically determine how brittle this interconnect is, right? And we show here is that you can use the correlation function not just to randomly search the space, but you can correlate this with a processing process, right? We can use a correlation function to model the microstructural change during an aging process. So in this, potentially this means that, okay, so if from the optimization, I determine, okay, this is the best microstructure I have, I can give you a time of aging, right? How long you keep the system in this at this temperature. So not only for 3D printing, but also can be correlated with the actual processing of material.
I see.
Yeah.
And also you can optimize the cost of producing this material.
Yes, exactly. So you have some information. If you incorporate physics and processing in your correlation function, in principle, you can, once you have the design, you have the microstructure, you can also have the associated processing parameter of how to make it. But of course, it's still going to be stochastic. You cannot make sure that each time you have exactly the same microstructure, but you have the statistical, microstructure in certain sense. Yes. So this is still about microstructure, and I'll quickly talk about how the second part, which the lattice model, comes in for the computational mechanics. So the idea is again straightforward, because when we talk about microstructure, basically this is a digital volume, right? So it naturally has a structure of a lattice or a network. So and the key is that there are many other available nice formulations, computational formulations to do the mechanical analysis, like finite element, for example, which has been generalized and developed, to a very advanced level. But I think, for our purposes, we prefer these lattice models because it's more naturally compatible with our microstructure model, which are based on lattices. So we don't have to do any fancy remeshing anymore. We can directly map our microstructure to one of the corresponding lattices, right? If the image is based on a cubic lattice in 3 dimensions or square lattice in 2 dimensions, this is already a mapping here. So we don't have to do additional work on this. But there are other issues with it, because these lattices, they have their intrinsic cubic symmetry, and the material in most cases isotropic. So in general, in order to correctly model the macroscopic material behavior using these lattice models, we have to overcome this difficulty. But typically this can be done by including successively larger and larger neighbor shells, right? If you just look at the first neighbor shell, clearly it wouldn't be very isotropic, but you can compensate this effect by including more and more neighbor shells. And the basic formulation for using a lattice model to model the continuum behavior of the material is the following. So in the continuum behavior, so basically we use the equivalence of the elastic energy principle, right? So the idea is that, okay, on the one hand, you have this continuum formulation where the elastic energy is written in terms of the stress and strain and all of the elastic constant. Okay, this is from continuum mechanics. But here, we use the lattice representation of the material, right? And in this case, material is defined by the points, which represents the center of each voxel, and they're connected by the springs of different spring constant. The key is that, in order to use the spring model to actually mimic the continuum mechanics, we need to find what are the correct spring constant, right, to use. So this will be done by using this elastic energy equivalent of elastic energy formulation. So we can easily write down the elastic energy for the continuum system. And in here, okay, we can equally write down the elastic energy for the spring network model using the spring constants that we define in the system. I will not go through the details of all these constants, but I do want to point out is that, one, I think, interesting, key thing in this what we call the non-local model is that we do not consider in the direct interaction between a pair of springs, which are, typically considered for all spring lattice models, but we also consider a kind of multi-body interaction. Okay, so basically this term corresponds to not the distance between two springs, but a kind of a volumetric deformation of all of these neighbors around these two particles. Okay, so I think Dr. Chen will provide more details on this formulation in his talk, but I just want to point out that this volumetric deformation actually helps a lot for us to compensate the Poisson's effect in the system. This means that if you use all their lattice, but you do not consider this volume term, this non-local volume term, you're restricted to only certain fixed values of Poisson's ratio for the system, because you didn't have the degree of freedom to choose the Poisson's ratio. But if you include this additional term, we allow to actually get the full range of Poisson's ratio that can be achieved for normal solid material. Okay, so again, this we once write down the elastic constant, the spring constant in terms of this formulation. If we allow these two to equal one another, we're able to derive analytically all of the spring constant for the lattice model, that in terms of the normal material elastic constant. Okay, so these are the actual values, but again, I won't go through all the details for different lattices. But this is again derived analytically, which is I think very elegant. But again, also there's a limitation for this, is because in the derivation we assume that the deformation of the lattice is very small. Okay, so I think we have similar considerations in the sweeping process as well. But if your deformation is large, and then you will see deviations from this, which again is a key concern in plasticity. But we'll address that later. So once you have this, the system, again, in our case, we will mainly focus on the cubic lattices, which are compatible with our microstructure. Okay, and numerically, once you formulate this into a sphere network model, the numerical solution seems to be very straightforward. You apply different boundary conditions, and you can use either implicit or explicit method to solve the forces, for example, and move each of the material points in the system as you apply the boundary condition, or you can use the implicit method by finding the equilibrium force equilibrium positions of each of the voxels in the system. Okay, I think we have heard a lot about this, so I will skip this part. And here I want to show you some interesting validation cases and examples. And the first one is the validation for the Poisson's ratio. Okay, so again, the goal here again is to mimic the mechanical behavior of a continuum material, right, in 2D and 3 dimensions. And on the one hand, we have this material constant from continuum mechanics. On the other hand, we have the spring constant. What we want to show here is that we want to confirm that the spring constant model can reproduce all of the desirable mechanical performance, at least in the elastic regime, of the actual continuum material. And this basically shows that in both 2 and 3 dimensions, we can achieve the full range of Poisson's ratio that's available for most of the common solid material. And
sorry,
the second,
yes. What input value I see? What is the vertical axis?
So vertical axis is the.
I cannot read. I simply cannot read. Can you just read?
Okay, so the thing is that, so in our model, if you go back to our model, right? So we want to use.
I'm saying that the font is small. I simply don't see.
Okay, so both of the vertical and horizontal values are the Poisson's ratio. One of them is from the actual, you basically, you have a set of material, right? You prescribe the normal elastic constant.
Sorry,
you have.
I now zoomed. It says output value. Okay, input value and.
Yes, input value and output value. So the input value is that I feed this model with the actual elastic constant of my material, and the output value is the computed value of the same constant, but using the lattice model. We want this value to be identical, right? If they're identical, this means that the lattice model will reproduce the mechanical performance, mechanical behavior. I'm sorry. So that's basically, so this should be actually along the perfect line, right? So this means that this lattice model perfectly capture at least this Poisson's effect. So that's the first validation. And the second one is we look at very simple elastic plastic behavior of a very typical plane element. Okay, so in this case we use the lattice model to compute the same loading and unloading history of this the plane, a rectangular plane with a hole in the middle, and we compare this result with well-developed finite element simulations. So I should mention that the plasticity part is I would say kind of easy to incorporate in the model, because now everything is based on the spring constant, right? So this overall plastic behavior can be easily modeled by looking at microplasticity, which means that each bound can have a elastic limit beyond which the material will have, this particular bound will exhibit plastic behavior. But the issue here is that, again, we need to take an engineering approach. We calibrate this local bound elastoplastic behavior so that the overall response, elastic plastic response of the material matches what we impose as the stress strain curve. So we don't have a theory to tell us exactly, how can you analytically find the local bound elastic plastic constituted relation. We have to do this using a calibration approach. But nonetheless, after calibration, we see that the current method can very well reproduce what has been produced using the best finite element simulation. So there's some discrepancies if you look more closely around this turnover region where the material exhibits transition from elastic to plastic behavior. But again, that is because this model, is not really fully a continuum-based model. It's a discrete model. So this is basically where you see some small deviations. And the last test is that we use this method to simulate the fracture behavior. And we just use this simple classic example to show the robust of the system. So, and these are again very classic test cases with experiments available and a lot of simulation techniques available. So you see the crack propagation under different loading conditions and in different crack configurations. And these analytical results from the Lattice model agree very well with the experiments and other simulations. Again, the generalization to the model to handle fracture is very straightforward. I think this is in the same spirit of Andrea's talk. You just impose a limit either on the length of the local spring or on the maximum stress on the local spring. Once this criteria is achieved, it breaks. Okay, and then this break gonna be accumulate and eventually see the pass. So, and here are a couple more applications for the method. After validating the method, we apply them to actual more complex engineering materials with the complex microstructure. We study both the simple deformation behavior and the fracture behavior of particle reinforced composites. Again, the results are very reasonable and statistically consistent with the experimental results. So with that, I want to quickly summarize the talk. So again, here we focus on structural property relations, and we talk about two lattice models that are important for this. The first one is for the microstructure, and the second one is for the mechanical property simulations. And the goal here again is to really enable material design, which I think will be the the key direction for in the community in the next decades. But one of the issues that we see here is that the lattice models currently we're working with are okay in terms that they can very for us to map the complex macrostructure to the lattice model, and the overall behavior and the predicted results are reasonable compared with experiments. But the problem is that it's not sufficient enough in most cases, because if you want to go back to the design, the idea is that you want to sample as many points as possible so that you can construct a very reliable response surface. But this means that you have to do a lot of forward simulations. You have to generate a lot of microstructure and compute the mechanical properties from the microstructure, and then collect these data and construct the points, the response surface. So this means that you need a very efficient way of evaluating the mechanical performance. So I think that's where the sweeping process theory comes in. And as Oleg has already mentioned, we have started some collaboration, which we want to use the sweeping theory, sweeping process theory to significantly accelerate this mechanical simulation so that we can enable the microstructure design. So with that, I'd like to thank the organizers again and my collaborators and students over the years.